This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance.
More than half a year has passed since Crysis Remastered launched, and now we have version 2.1 just releasing. At launch, I saw a lot of good with regards to the tech, but also a lot of not so good things when looking at the remastering of one of my favorite games. So I thought with this 2.1 patch, it would be the right time to give an updated appraisal of Crysis Remastered. In this video, I will examine the 2.1 patch for Crysis Remastered on PC, checking out what NVIDIA's DLSS brings to the table, what improvements might have happened to the remastering since launch, and what areas might still be needing improvement. So hop on board and let's take another look at Crysis Remastered on PC in this updated form. Let's first start off with the newest addition to the game, and that is NVIDIA's Deep Learning Super Sampling, or DLSS for short. Here the user is presented with four options: Ultra Performance, Performance, Balanced, and Quality. Examining the image quality here, we are looking at an implementation of DLSS which shares many of the same characteristics as seen in other DLSS implementations. In comparison to the game's standard TAA, Quality mode at 4K produces higher edge quality anti-aliasing, like you can see here on this metal sheet fence in front of the Jeep on the right hand side. With TAA, the lines on the fence are incomplete and aliased and jagged. With DLSS in quality mode, the lines are completed rather perfectly. This same behavior can be seen if you look at other distant detail like the dark brown branches on these trees in the background. TAA produces aliasing on the edges of these branches, while DLSS keeps the same level of detail there while having better anti-aliasing. Crysis Remastered offers more than standard TAA and a number of SMAA modes, but here I will just compare it to SMAA 1TX, which forgoes the accumulation step to leave a much rawer image than standard TAA. In comparison to DLSS and TAA, SMAA 1TX leaves a much sharper image, but looking at that actual image, you can see a lot of aliasing in motion with a lot of flickering, especially in trees. And this is generally a negative aspect of image quality. I honestly prefer the DLSS image in such cases, given the amount of foliage this game has. Interestingly, Crytek has left a lot of the DLSS tweaking parameters available in the game's console, and it is possible to fiddle with the DLSS bicubic-like sharpening that is by default off actually, so these images I've shown have been without sharpening so far. If you enable that sharpening step, this is how DLSS's resolve looks at the standard 0.39 level of sharpening versus its default mode without sharpening and TAA. I find it amazing that Crytek left these parameters to be so tweakable so you can get the exact image quality out of DLSS that you want. And I honestly wish other games with DLSS added the ability to tweak these DLSS values. So I think this is generally an amazing DLSS implementation, but there are some downsides, like every one before it. As per usual, alpha-tested foliage at a distance can have minor bits of ghosting, like you can see here, and also distant objects that seem to be lacking motion vectors, I would imagine. Where with DLSS on, you can see it kind of moving in a strange manner and kind of smearing. You can see this at times for animated geometry at a distance with DLSS on. In terms of performance, DLSS in a game like this has its best benefits for lower end GPUs of the RTX stack that are going to be more GPU limited. Looking at the RTX 2060, DLSS can take GPU limited areas of the game like here on the fleet deck at native 4K up into the 30 FPS range in quality mode at 4K, whereas native is constantly in the mid to upper 20s, improving performance on average by around 33%. Going to performance mode sees FPS here at 4K and high settings being improved by around 80%. Still, I think this use case at these settings is a bit academic, as people are going to be wanting to go for flat 60 FPS, which is kind of the point of utilizing reconstruction in the first place. So DLSS sees some great utility, I think, at 1440p, where it takes an average frame rate at 1440p on this GPU in the low 40s to be above 60 FPS through the entirety of this very GPU-limited area in Crysis Remastered at high settings. Probably the most GPU-limited area in the game, essentially improving performance in quality mode here by around 50% on average. Performance mode takes this one rather intense step further by improving performance by nearly 90% here. Although I think for most users, the rather solid 60 FPS provided by something like quality mode here is enough without having to have any of the image quality degradation that performance mode at 1440p tends to have. A game is only as interesting or as good as its gameplay components, no matter how fancy the graphics are. And I always thought Crysis for its time had amazing freeform gameplay. That entire experience of the campaign, with all of its variety in 2007, was just incredible. And maintaining parity with that original 2007 release is one area where Crysis Remastered at launch in September had a few missteps. Thankfully, I can report that a number of these missteps have been corrected. The first of which is in character control. At launch, the classic suit controls were almost in a beta state with awkward transitions and missing features. Now they feel much more like the original game, so you can now lean in first person, working exactly like one would expect who has experience with the original game. And now switching between suit modes while in motion has a similar fluidity and cadence to the original, allowing for chained speed mode jumps like you might have seen in your favorite Nanosuit Ninja videos. And in a fortunate change of events, the infamous Ascension level has returned to Crysis Remastered on PC. In this level, you commandeer a VTOL, fight flying Ceph forms, and fly off to the carriers in the sunset. It is a bit gimmicky, but at the same time it just showed off how versatile the CryEngine 2 was at the time, and it also showed off how well CryEngine 2 could wreck your PC. This level ran really poor on PCs at the time, and it runs poor on PCs now, which is one of the reasons why it was probably cut from the console release of Crysis in 2011. But now, unlike in September, Ascension is back and is fully playable from start to finish, and runs just fine actually in terms of CPU performance, which is definitely very different from the original, which just hoses the CPU and is extremely poor to play. While Ascension is back, other things are still missing, like the ability to manually save the game, or of course, multiplayer. But for the most part, gameplay and missions are now much closer to the original 2007 Crysis, and this 2.1 version is a great improvement over launch. Another issue at launch was CPU performance. At similar view distance settings to the original Crysis, the game of course ran much better than that 2007 release. But when you would put settings any higher, like up to high, the CPU inefficiencies would show greatly, where one thread would be completely hammered. You could achieve greater view distance settings than the original game, but at a heavy cost. The game was just incredibly CPU inefficient. Here I have news of some improvements, but also of some things which are largely the same. Firstly, ray tracing no longer has a measurable performance hit on the CPU that was evidenced at launch. The ray tracing workload seems to be more properly distributed along the CPU, and turning it on does not amplify the game's overly single-threaded performance. Another improvement since release is that ray tracing no longer induces a semi-periodic stutter on PC. At release, in the Harbor mission for example, just running forward would see large stutters on the frame time graph like you can see on the left here, with momentary pauses. The version 2.1 on the right-hand side does not have this issue and runs, in comparison, much smoother at the same settings on the same configuration. In terms of CPU performance across the settings between versions, I've measured margin of error level of differences between the September release at very high settings at 1080p with CPU limited performance, and the same with high settings with CPU limited performance at 1080p. But I did manage to measure a 6% on average faster CPU limited performance in version 2.1 at 1080p when set to the medium setting, as the medium setting on release here in this view had a high variability of frame rate. Another issue at release was a deep-rooted CryEngine run where for some reason, increasing output resolution has an effect on CPU performance. Here I can report that the behavior is still reproducible as of version 2.1. Starting at 720p, going up to 1080p reduced CPU limited performance by 23%, and going up to 4K by 30% in comparison to 720p. This is related to the chosen output resolution, mind you, so internal scaling modes like DLSS have no effect on this behavior. So CPU performance is better, but similar in many ways. At the same time, version 2.1 looks better at the same settings. Check out this shot here at 1080p high settings between the versions. If you notice, there are many more visible shadows in 2.1 on the distant trees on the hillside, or many more shadows being cast from the scattered objects in the town. This is because the game since release has increased the range of screen space shadows, which greatly aids the visuals, especially on lower settings where shadow maps at a distance are too low resolution or objects fall out of the shadow cascade at a distance, which I think means we need a new appraisal of my optimized settings. At release, I said keeping CPU performance and headroom high on the CPU is very important to make sure you stick to 60 FPS. That meant keeping CPU related settings like objects, shadows, and vegetation at medium, and then turning up any of the other settings like shading, physics, particles, volumetrics, etc. to anything as you see fit, as those other settings almost have no CPU cost at all. This is still true as of version 2.1, but I have also deduced a more nuanced view of what is most costly on the CPU so we can have more accurate optimized settings. Essentially, the most costly CPU related setting you can change is the vegetation one. Going from medium to high vegetation drops CPU limited performance by 30%, to very high by 40%, and in Can It Run Crysis mode by 52%. The other two CPU related settings are cheaper. Tweaking object detail to high decreases CPU limited performance by 15%, to very high by 20%, and Can It Run Crysis by 43%. With shadows going from medium to high reduces CPU limited performance by 5%, very high by 15%, and Can It Run Crysis mode by 20%. Now in general, for long views like this one, the object setting looks to have the best visual impact, as it adds many more distant trees and other objects. So it's great in a shot like this. The shadow setting comparatively now, since screen space shadows are in, shows very little visual differences between the settings in a view like this. While the vegetation setting in this view looks to have a very low visual impact for its high cost, the setting is actually very important in standard gameplay scenarios and medium range views like you see here, where at higher than medium, the draw range of grass, bushes, and tree stumps is healthily increased, whereas medium here can have rather distracting pop-in at normal gameplay distances. With this information in mind, my new optimized recommendations are slightly different. As I see it, you should still start at that base of medium for shadows, objects, and vegetation in this game, but if you have great single-threaded CPU performance, then your first priority is to increase vegetation to high, and if you have even better single-threaded performance, add object detail to high on top of that. But what type of CPU can actually run some of these settings at high? Let's take a look at the mid-range Ryzen 3600 at 1440p to determine that. And remember, increasing resolution decreases CPU performance. When overlooking the expensive town area at these medium settings here, the Ryzen 3600 is at 150 FPS. Adding in high vegetation decreases performance to 110 FPS. And adding in object detail to high decreases performance to 90 FPS. At around 90 FPS in a view like this, the CPU headroom will be just enough to keep most gameplay above 60, but honestly, in more intense scenarios like in the town, you might see CPU drops below 60. So adding in shadows, which further drops performance by around 7% to 84 FPS, would eliminate that important CPU headroom that this game needs to keep its head above 60 FPS at 1440p. So based on this, I have some rules. If you're at 1440p and have a CPU with single-threaded performance equal to a Ryzen 3600, you should put vegetation to high for your optimized settings if you do not want to drop frequently below 60 FPS. If your CPU has better single-threaded performance, like a Ryzen 5000 series or the last few generation of Intel chips, then you can put up object detail to high as well perhaps, at this 1440p resolution. If you are increasing or decreasing resolution from 1440p, then you actually have to adjust these settings down or up accordingly based upon what that resolution is, and as odd as that sounds. So in the end here, CPU performance in Crysis Remastered is still an area where I'm not exactly happy with it, as it's hard to optimize for since CPU requirements change so counterintuitively with your output resolution. But what about the various other artistic discrepancies like I mentioned in my initial review? Some things are different that I did notice, like the fence posts. These now, in the latest version, break off bit by bit as far as I can tell, like in the original 2007 Crysis, instead of the big chunks that they broke off in on release. Other areas of artistic discrepancy have seen less changes, like skin shaders are time of day. So Prophet in the beginning of Relic in the cinematic there looks just as pale and a little strange like he did at launch day. Likewise, overpressure from grenade explosions does not cause foliage to rustle like it did in the 2007 PC original. And similarly to launch day in September, foliage does seem to be updating still for many pieces of foliage in a frame slicing way. So it doesn't update at your native frame rate, even though you can be rather close to the foliage. This is something the original Crysis does not do. There are some other surprises though in this 2.1 version, like the fact that the Ascension level uses the volumetric clouds CryEngine 2 has, which are an integral part to making that level look at all good. And it does manage to still awe in many ways all these years later due to these clouds. Yet this level was not ever released on console, so a lot of the art that they're using here is just taken over from the original PC release. So other levels that are still based upon a lot of the art decisions made for the console version of Crysis share those deficiencies still. The opening level, for example, on PC in the 2007 release uses those same volumetric clouds found on Ascension, yet they have not updated the art on this level to use those clouds that we can find in Ascension. This is an area where I would really still like to see improvement, and at this point in time I do definitely think this is an area where the community should be brought in, since they have such a passion for Crysis. If the sandbox editor were released, I imagined a lot of these artistic discrepancies I've talked about could be remedied over time by the community, and that's something I would really like to see Crytek do. Getting to the end here, version 2.1 is much improved over the launch version of Crysis Remastered on PC, and DLSS is great for those who are GPU limited and have RTX cards. But a number of launch issues are still there concerning the art or CPU performance. Also, there have been some new issues that have crept in, like how motion blur in 2.1 is rather broken at the moment, so I actually had to turn it off for nearly all the recordings I made for this video. I imagine that'll get fixed rather soon though. I'm really happy Crytek has been pushing to iterate on Crysis Remastered since launch, but I do seriously hope they consider releasing this game's editor, just like the original Crysis had in 2007, as that is the next big step as I see it to ensure that Crysis Remastered is still being played long into the future like the original game has been since 2007. But that's really enough for me for now. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to get this video in the highest quality available, support DF on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about Crysis Remastered on PC, write a comment below or follow me in Digital Foundry on Twitter. As always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
Copy, Psycho. I'm inbound. ETA 10 minutes.
Make it quick, mate. I've got you a little souvenir.
A breakthrough in design and engineering, the G915 features Lightspeed Pro-Grade Wireless, advanced LightSync RGB, and new high-performance, low-profile mechanical switches. Meticulously crafted from premium materials, the G15 is a sophisticated design of unparalleled beauty, strength and performance. Meet G15 Lightspeed and play the next dimension.